A saying I have grown very fond of in recent years is, know your history. It seems very few of us do. We have allowed ourselves to be placed on narrative rafts in a roiling river, doomed to rhyme with the sourest notes of our past. In fact, one of those notes is a perennial inability to remember the history one is destined to repeat. My life has taught me that the debates on the truth of an axiom can be compared to a mathematical function. A function is made up of two parts: the derivative, which describes the motion of the data, and the phase, which pins the function to a starting point, making each input give a unique answer. The questions we as the body politic are asked to answer behave in a similar way. Without the knowledge of where the causes of our debates started, we can use the correct derivative as much as we want, but we will remain out of phase, and as a result, we'll never get where we want to go. So let's get in phase with our history. On what foundations is our shining city built? How did we pick this hill for it? We live in a society. No, I'm serious. Stop laughing. No, I will not wipe this clown makeup off. But seriously, we live in the context of civilization. What is civilization? Literally, it means life in cities. How did cities develop? At the dawn of humanity, life was harsh, and survival was an all-consuming affair. But with the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, suddenly, the small bands had excess, and no longer needed to move toward their food sources, instead being bound to the terrain, near sources of water. This excess of sustenance allowed for the bands to grow in size and entice immigrants and acolytes. This led to the first cities. Rapidly, the division of labor created specialists, and the increasing population density both pushed food production outside the city walls and created the need to coordinate efforts in groups beyond familial and friendship ties. In the military, a company is defined as the largest group of men that a single leader can reasonably command and control, which is why it is never more than a couple hundred strong. Anything past that begins requiring an increasingly complex structure to coordinate. The cities became the centers that could coordinate the distribution of excess food and had developed all the infrastructure that concentrated humanity requires. Experts at tool making, clothing manufacturers and menders, builders, artists, all of this was incredibly valuable, and so a partnership grew between the work the city dwellers could do and the sustenance from beyond their walls they relied on. Voila! A society! Now, in order to keep up with the needs of the growing polises, both the agrarians and the urbanites who built up these cities needed increased help. These opportunities drew even more people from the wandering life into civilization. Now, suddenly the civilization wasn't the close-knit group of families and friends who started the settlement, but the group continues to act as one entity. How to determine who will be making the decisions? Now you have government. From here, all civilizations follow a very similar path. Those that created the way of life which was drawing more and more residents to it named themselves the elite, the patricians, the aristocrats, the nobility, the establishment. Power to make decisions would be theirs. After all, without them, there would be no civilization for everyone to be drawn to. Those that joined to devote their labor in exchange for the opportunity to live within the city's walls became the plebeians, the peasants, the common folk, the working class. What's the difference between these two groups? The simplest way to see it, those that founded the cities quite literally were the giants upon whose shoulders everyone stood. They set up the structures inside which everyone lived. Their blood, sweat, and tears were the literal foundation of each civilization. Meanwhile, in order to keep making the city better for everyone, the other group exchanged their labor for both monetary value and the right to be considered under the protection of the leaders. This is how sovereignty, in the form of an informal franchise, wound up divided between the two groups. There was no desire by some wealthy group of people to subjugate another for their own benefit. No oppressor eternally oppressing the marginalized class. Instead, it was a symbiotic relationship formed between one group which built the cities and those willing to work in exchange for the benefits of urban life. As time passed, however, the situation would inevitably become more complicated. Generations pass, and suddenly the franchise is no longer with those who built the cities, but with their distant descendants. The children of the immigrants are now putting their own blood, sweat, and tears into new cornerstones of the society. From here, each culture determines on their own how to define sovereignty. But there comes a time where the order of things can no longer be sustained, as the original raison d'etre for everything has been forgotten. And the structures have transformed so much, they are no longer fit for purpose. Each generation, a culture, and most importantly the nature of its people, finds definition through conflict. They find themselves lacking. When history finds them lacking enough times in a row, they fall. But it is a quiet thing. Before everyone admits that the terrible end has happened, the leaders find themselves with the inordinate power to be the only guarantors of stability in their immediate area, and the split between the two major groups becomes deeper and calcified. In the desperate rush to halt the entropy of order and keep chaos from tearing down the walls, the aristocracy seizes the entirety of the franchise, and more besides, becoming total sovereigns. Thus, monarchies and autocracies are born. Those that have scrounged some rights in exchange for their labor become serfs, under the total thrall of those who now consider themselves the better men. A select few civilizations have, in the course of history, attempted to contain the inevitable entropy of time. The Romans called it the res public, the public thing. We call it a republic, the rule of law. The idea is, if one develops a set of rights and responsibilities for the members of a society while its founders are still building it, then such liberty and those values can be protected from the whims of the sovereign, be that the king, the small council, or the baying mob. For example, in America, my rights to freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition are not up to a vote. The other interesting process of history is the change in definition of what a franchise is. As an example, even before the War of Independence, the American way of ensuring fair and representative government was to extend the franchise to each household that owned the land they lived on. The thought was that the easiest way to ensure that the body politic could be defined flexibly enough to always include the entirety of those who held up society would be to define it as those who could make the considerable effort required to be able to provide for themselves their own subsistence and shelter. Also, note that I said the lowest unit of the demos was the household, not the individual. We seem to have forgotten this lesson, that the foundational element of society is not each atomized individual, but the family. Now, under this setup, the individual could be the only one represented by their vote, should they be a lone male or female landowner. These days, we understand the individual as the quanta of the demos, and this results in both increased atomization and loneliness, but also in a misreading of how the franchise expanded throughout our history. It wasn't that women didn't have the vote. It was the result of women staying with their parental families until marriage, at which point they would direct their husband on how to represent the family in the vote. As sending him off alone would keep her safer in a time when voting was not the nearly laborless process it is today. A single woman who owned her own land voted as early as the 1600s in the colonies. It was just that such an existence was rare for a female of the time. Perhaps this is in some degree a false memory created by the perspective of the relics that have survived to the present, but why does it seem the West, and America especially, used to have confidence in itself but no longer does? Much like Rome had lost confidence in itself as it was being converted by the cult of Christ. There is this image we have of manifest destiny, of the post-war consensus, of Pax Americana. You look at what cultural products were 70 years ago, and there was an understanding of who we are, what we represent, and that the American way is the shining city. Yet I have witnessed over and over again us acting as if maybe our enemies had a point, that we were too soft, that our way won't stand up to hard times, despite the fact that it is the belief in our ways that has led us to victory in those very same dark moments. Yet I have also seen that belief in ourselves, and what Lady Columbia represents. There is a meme that immigrants are more American than the native-born population. America is a nation founded as a colony across the sea, and even today is the major coast-to-coast power of an entire continent. Therefore, our civilization has the unique opportunity to tie the story of any immigrant into that tradition. Their very presence should compel them to absorb the monoculture of their adopted land. True immigration, especially in the earlier days of America, when travel was arduous enough to mandate serious forethought, was an expression of freedom of association on the part of both the native-born citizens and their new acolytes. As a result, the immigrants were those who were willing to make the effort to formally associate with those already here. This willingness and deliberate effort to become Americans meant that they valued the association they entered into. This fealty and the catharsis of making the deliberate journey to come to the new world therefore added energy and self-confidence to the soul of the country. It did not matter how much entropy had sapped the formalist structure of the nation from those who had spent generations considering it a birthright. The forged-in-fire new citizens would provide the next bit of energy necessary to keep the dream alive. Maybe these attributes are what made America the most energetic, self-confident, and as a result successful nation on Earth in the 20th century. Rome was similar in the beginning. Between their founding mythos as the union of two tribes and the requirement that the early aristocracy provide both their own bodies and arms as the military in exchange for the franchise, Rome represented the most meritocratic patrician-plebeian split in antiquity. As their realm grew, they had to expand who could undertake military service, and as a result, the Romans felt such willingness to defend the res public demanded expanding the franchise and citizenship to these servicemen. For a time, this also kept Rome vital, as in order to keep their franchise, these veterans often became pillars of the plebeian community. But eventually, such an expansion became separated from the intentionality of putting life on the line for the body politic, and the entropy in action against the soul of the natural-born Romans watered down the national character still further. When neither element of society has to do the hard work to keep their blood, sweat, and tears in the foundations, their decisions of how to maneuver the ship of state becomes less and less well considered as well. Something given has no value until, eventually, Rome died a quiet death, and its colonies devolved into feudal kingdoms and protectorates. And so it will come for us one day. Our misunderstanding of how our own history and franchise evolved creates opportunities for the Fontaines of the world to feed our function the wrong phase, ensuring we will never get where we want to go. Nay, where we need to go. The increasing separation of intentionality from association into our civilization threatens to eliminate the regenerative properties of the immigrant for the American soul, while the overwhelming amount of those for whom being American is a birthright of geography removes any value from the establishment classes. Thermodynamics and history tell us entropy is inevitable, and we have all learned that fire and forget citizenship is no way to survive and thrive. So I close as I open. Know your history, for it may save your people's soul. Thank you very much for sticking with me for this long and complex discussion on where we have come from and where we will be going. Next week, I'll be discussing something positive for once. It'll be the first in a two-part series on a positive narrative that exists in recent art for our children, to help them gain a three-dimensional understanding of what their life journey may be, with a discussion of the How to Train Your Dragon animated film series. As always, please let me know how off my history is down in the comments. Like and subscribe, share with your battle buddies, and have a great day.